Hawaii. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. How you guys doing? Hope everybody's doing well. I appreciate you guys making the time to be here. Again, on my channel and learning with me, learning together. Today, we're gonna continue reading from this pretty good book, actually great book from, of course, Jack D. Forbes. Jack has so many books we've gotten into, and this is one of them. It's called The American Discovery of Europe by Jack D. Forbes. And today we're going to go to chapter 5. I just want to say we have read some excerpts from chapter 5. We read a little couple things here and there in old videos, but we never read the whole chapter. This chapter has a lot of good drop, a lot of great information. And I did say that I wanted to get back into it and finish up the whole chapter, and I hadn't yet. It's been a couple years, so we're gonna do that today, guys. Again, I appreciate you guys being here for that and reading this chapter with me today. Okay, and this is the chapter right here, from Iberia to the Baltic: Americans in Roman and pre-modern Europe. It says here, many American nations have traditions pointing towards animals as teachers of human beings, and it is certain that the ancient Americans learned much from carefully, consistently observing the lessons offered by the natural world and its living children. Indigenous Americans often seem to have made it a major part of their lives to watch the animals, the birds, and other living things in order to learn their secrets, in order to understand the patterns of their behavior. I believe that we can be absolutely sure that Americans of old, putting out in boats into the waters of the Caribbean, of the mouth of the Amazon, in the Florida Straits, or in the Gulf Streams farther north, would have studied the moving rivers with infinite care, would have in fact mapped out the precise movements of the currents and winds with extreme exactitude, and certainly would have observed the onward traveling of huge numbers of logs, branches, debris, and what is more important still, the behavior of animals in the streams. All right, so what he's letting you know is, of course, we knew about the Gulf Stream and the ocean currents. People notice things, observation, many years. That's what science is, right? Observation and hypothesis and seeing, experimenting, right? So ancient Americans did that. They noticed that things got caught in streams, that things were brought from other places, and eventually they probably started following those Gulf streams and currents and ending up in different places in the world. The logs and the animals, such as the marine turtles of America, were clearly going somewhere, but where? And for the people in the Amazon Caribbean region, it was obvious that floating things were also arriving from the east. All right, they were arriving also. We weren't just going. So they saw things going and things coming in, right? That's what they were observing. And especially when they observed the turtles, right? The turtles, just like in the movie Nemo, how they were riding the currents, right? The turtles, right? So they noticed that. Turtle Island, right? Certainly there were rivers in the oceans that formed great circles and going and returning. But the turtles of American waters are especially important, particularly the great leathery turtle. One was washed ashore at Harlech, North Wales in 1988, weighing 2,106 pounds and measuring about 10 feet in length and 9 feet across the span of its front flippers. In point of fact, it is very rewarding to look at the behavior of American marine turtles, because their movements going back millions of years provide a ready guide for watchful human hunters and sailors. There is absolutely no doubt that American turtles followed the Gulf Stream to Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly, and Devonshire's coast, as well as on occasion to Iceland, Norway, and in one case at least to Murmansk. They may have even returned to the American tropics, as will be discussed below. The earliest European drawing of an American turtle is from the 1100s. E. Charles Nelson, who has written about drift seeds, knows that a churchyard slate of the 12th century in Cornwall, Tintagel Island, has a vivid thumbnail sketch of a common loggerhead turtle. These animals, natives of the American coast, are frequently stranded on Cornish shores. 5 species of turtles have been reported from British waters in modern post-1700 times. They are the leathery, the common loggerhead, Kemp's Ridley, the green, and hawksbill, very rare. The first 3 are the most common. The leathery nests primarily in Guyana, South America, but also along East Florida. Leatheries are seen often of Northeast America, Connecticut to Newfoundland, where they feed on jellyfish in waters up to 15 Celsius colder than those in which they nest in Florida. The turtle's temperature may be as much as 18 Celsius warmer than the surrounding water. In 1958, a leathery was seen off Norway at 69 degrees 18 north, and another off northern Iceland in 1963. A common loggerhead was caught in a fishing line off Murmansk in 1964. The powerful, leathery turtle may well have the stamina to return south. R.D. Penn Hallwig tells us that the circulation of the oceans makes it unlikely that turtles of any species from the Mediterranean or West Africa would reach British shores. All right? As this would entail swimming for hundreds of miles against the prevailing currents. All right, guys? He goes on to inform us that evidence from other organisms, some the food of leathery turtles, as from inanimate objects, all point to the West Indies and the northern shore of South America as the origin of turtles stranded on British and Irish shores. As recently as December 1986, a speedboat turned up at St. Ives, in all probability from the southern United States. Penhallwig also reviews the evidence supplied by Charles Nelson and others relative to the drift seeds and other American items that turn up on the coast of Cornwall, Western Ireland, and Scotland. Indeed, the earliest European reference to them comes from Cornwall, where they were collected by Dame Catherine Killigrew before 1570, who said that the faith of the Cornish folks was that they drifted from the New World because of the winds. Most of the seeds turn up on the north coast of Cornwall and in the Isles of Scilly, as many as 24 species being represented, all right? Seeds from America. Seeds from America. The huge leathery turtles, incidentally, often could be seen traveling or floating on the surface of the water, as were 3 seen together on 2 occasions off the southwest coast of Cornwall in 1967 by a British trawler's crew. They are accompanied apparently by pilotfish, Nocrates ductor, which have been seen with them off of both Cornwall and Norway. Loggerhead turtles also reach European Atlantic waters after nesting along the Georgia and Florida coast, in the dry Tortugas, and along the Mexican coast. Loggerheads reach 300 pounds or more, but those reached in Britain are usually juveniles or subadults, who reportedly, when just hatched, make rapidly for the warm Gulf Stream waters. The specimens reaching European Atlantic shores are probably of American origin. Indeed, some have been washed ashore, as in Cornwall in 1938, in company with Kemp's Ridley, which cannot have come from anywhere else. Hawksbill turtles from Guyana and the Caribbean region are rarer in British waters, but in 1867, one was recorded in the English Channel, and in 1983, a 280-pound one was netted off a Cork island. Ireland. I said island. The discovery of Europe by American marine turtles. All right, so it was the turtles who discovered Europe first, all right, from Turtle Island. I believe of great significance, especially as we look to the meeting of classical America. It seems beyond doubt that American seafarers, especially from turtle-watching regions, would have noted the traveling patterns of the turtles especially since they surface frequently and are of huge enough size to be followed day after day. Turtle following, as well as other maritime activities, undoubtedly took many mariners far and far out to sea. But I would suggest that there would often be the curious few who would pursue the turtle's watery path all the way to Europe, and then perhaps to return along the same path to America, once again, following its southern, southwestern, and western arcs. All right, we've shown the currents, how they return right back to America. The ones that brings you right from the Caribbean, South America into Europe, it loops back around into South America. A study has shown that Florida-born loggerhead turtles can navigate across the Atlantic and return to American waters using a subtle signal of Earth's magnetic field. The signals help baby loggerheads to stay within the circular ocean currents of warm water, moving clockwise from America to Europe and then back again via the coast of Spain and Northwest Africa, then turning west to complete the circle. This turtle migration path is some 8,000 miles in length. It is not possible that Americans were able to learn of this phenomenon and how to use it to their advantage navigationally. Isn't it possible? Couldn't they have done that? Passing from turtle travel to human movement, it has been suggested that clay figurines and other arts of Mexico contain images suggestive of European, Semitic, African, dodge the hijack. I mean, when you look like what you're supposed to, what a supposed Negro only looks like. So when they're, we got to dodge the hijack when we read these books, right? We already know. And Asiatic features, right? If so, then we might be looking at very concrete evidence that Americans not only visited Europe and Africa, but brought back mental images that they were able to share with their country women or men. This possibility is strengthened by the alleged Roman-like head found in Mastlacinca, Calixta, Huaca, Wakanda, Waka pyramid, and by an alleged Hebrew or other Semitic inscription found in Cherokee area cave under burials and dated in the 2nd century also. All right, so again, we got to keep dodging the hijack because he's saying just because he's finding these old world things over here that they had to have come from the other side. But remember, America is the true old world. All right, that's why they're finding all this stuff here. The alleged Roman type terracotta head has recently been dated by thermoluminescent age tests with a date of 250 AD to plus 400 years. This is rather interesting because it makes the terracotta roughly the same age as a bronze head of American with a question mark. A bronze head now housed in the Louvre in Paris. And all right, so real quick, guys. All right, let's go back somewhere. Did a video where I just wanted to show the actual primary source of what he was talking about right now. And it's this one right here. American Indians shipwrecked in Roman Germany, 60 BC, guys. That's when it was. All right. We have a reference of these so-called Romans writing about American Indians arriving in their shores. All right. So let's continue. He's talking about a bronze head that is possibly American. Now housed in the Louvre in Paris, the Louvre Museum. In any case, the head seems to have been found in either Mount 5 or Mount 6 at Calixtlahuacla in the 1930s. It was found with pottery of the 1476-1510 period above a 12th century level as part of a burial offering. Scholars involved in the latest analysis of the Cabecita de Barro suggest that the Mastlacincas, as allies of the Aztecs, participated in 2 war expeditions between 1440 and 1469. One to the coastal area of the Huastecas, from which they returned with a rich booty. Thus, they might have acquired the head from the Huastecas, who presumably might have held it for a millennium or more. Of course, a number of ifs remain in the story, but nonetheless, it does suggest an American Huasteca voyage to the European area, Gaul, Iberia. Who is the Gauls? Who's the Iberians? And a return voyage to the Gulf of Mexico. The authors of the latest report, Romeo Histroff and Santiago Genoves, express the normal Eurocentric idea of a Mediterranean vessel being swept away from the Canary Islands, Madeira, or Cape Verde to the American coast. All right, that's a Eurocentric idea. Got dodge the hijack. On the other hand, let us emphasize that while we have quite a number of references to Americans reaching Europe to be discussed, we have absolutely no references to Europeans reaching America by any route prior to the Norse navigation. All right, prior to the what? The Vikings. Given the extent of Roman, Greek, Carthaginian, and other historical sources, and given the existence of numerous geographies written by people such as Pliny, Strabo, Pomponius Mela, I think that we can say that the ball is in America's court and not in Europe's, okay? When you really start doing the research, verifying history, these old records, you're going to see there's more reports of people watching the shore from America and Europe. So the ball is in America's court, not Europe. I am, of course, not arguing against the theoretical possibility of a Roman drift voyage, but I am saying that when we find terracottas, coins, or other relics of supposed European origin in America, we must give primacy to American agency, not European. Not Europeans coming over here. You understand? Just because you find Shemitic or something that looks Roman or something that looks like a Greek or something that looks like whatever you think is European or from another part of the world, Hindu or whatever you want to call it, Phoenician, don't just think automatically that there's people that came from another part. This is the true old world. He's saying it in a different way. European or Euro-American writers almost always see such items as evidence of European or Semitic voyages to America. But given what we know now about American seafaring, all right, guys, given what we have learned, right, in the last couple videos, especially when we read his book and other books, we know Americans were navigating since ancient times. Given that knowledge that we have now, right, about American seafaring and cultural sophistication, it is much more likely that they are things seen by American travelers, images brought home after voyages and shared by means of art. So now he's kind of like adding his little opinion because he still thinks the old world is on the other side. So he's saying it doesn't mean people came. It could be that Americans went over there and just brought the images back with them. But no, these were Americans. America's the true old world. But of course, not everyone will agree on their authenticity. In any case, given the long-term interest of some religious sects and nationalities in proving the truth of their own particular ideology, the Sultan intentional contamination of archaeological sites always remains a possibility, along with the misinterpretation of such items as clay heads with beards and other specific features. All right, so he pointed out something really good. So people find statues here with beards and all that, they automatically say, oh, that's Shemitic. We had beards here, guys. We had all types of hair. We had all types of phenotypes. We had every shade of copper complexion, from the lightest copper complexion to the darkest so-called black, right? Copper complexion. So you got to dodge your own hijacks. People are intentionally contaminating archaeological sites. Nonetheless, I will argue that we must accept the probability of American agency and that the art pieces must be viewed as a kind of photographic record of indigenous travels. In Peru, a woven cotton textile of alleged pre-Columbian origin depicts persons riding on horseback, something clearly to be seen in Europe or Asia, but not in pre-1492 America. All right, dodge the hijack big time right there. You know, I want to tell you guys, especially for those who've been following me for a while, horses originated in America and they went into Asia. We've proven that. You can Google that right now. All right. And we have writings of the Spanish seeing horses here when they got here. We've done a video on that actually, guys. So if you haven't seen it, make sure to catch up. All right. So again, he's going with the whole everybody came out of that part of the world over there still, even though he's finding undeniable proof that Americans were navigating all over the world. So he's trying to explain why there would be all these features and all this stuff over here. And he's saying, well, they brought it back. No, it's been here. It's from here. All right. Horses are from here. Since one cannot imagine a European or Asian producing Andean cloth, one must assume that an American made the textile with this illustration, thus indicating a visit to Europe. Again, not necessarily, guys. We had horses here, Africa or Asia, and returned to Peru, provided, of course, that the tejido or the sewing has been properly dated. Indeed, the section of the cloth depicting horses is rather non-Andean in appearance and suggests a post-Spanish conquest date. As regard the clay heads in Mexico that are alleged to depict Africans, right? They're talking about phenotypes. They're not talking about they actually prove that somebody came here from a ship, an actual African, and came and built a city in Mexico. All right, so they're talking about this clay head in Mexico that supposedly depicts Africans. They're just talking about phenotypes, right? Europeans. They're talking about phenotypes and Asiatics, right? So we had all those phenotypes here. Again, America's the true old world. Donald Cordry, an authority on Mexican masks, has stated, any attempt to date a mask becomes an extremely questionable estimate. The inability to date Mexican masks stems from a temporal ambiguity in Mexican culture, an ambiguity that is one of its essential characteristics and charms. It is not uncommon to find pre-conquest ideas and beliefs existing side by side with modern ones. He further notes that one of the more common methods of dating artwork is to use stylistic trends as criteria. However, the cultural diversity and complexity of Mexico precludes, all right, again, the cultural diversity and complexity of Mexico precludes the identification of traditional styles in any but the most general terms. Far too vague to base any estimate of a mass age upon the popularity of Negrito African masks in post-conquest Mexico. All right, yes, we had so-called Negrito phenotypes in the pottery and the statues found throughout the Americas, and they're not Africans. We've already passed that. We passed the whole out of Africa theories. So let's continue. All right, so we're talking about the Negrito mask, right? So he's going over some things they finding over here, these different phenotypes in the ancient pre-Columbian America. All right. So, along with common production of masks with European features, raises many questions about the dating of alleged pre-Columbian figurines. Perhaps only a chemical analysis can actually date such materials. Now, the use of art to support pre-Columbian contacts can also be extended to American arrivals in Europe and the Mediterranean. For example, I possess a photograph of the figure of an Egyptian man of Tetesalt from the 14th siècle avant. Oh, that's BC. I think that's 14th century BC. All right, here we go. Some parents, yeah. Well, I know a little French, I can read it, which decidedly resembles an American. From the 14th century BC, that resembles an American. He's supposed to be Egyptian. Well, check this out. Shout out to UBTV, Drop, and everybody else who's teaching this. America, ancient Egypt was here. We're not talking about the word Egypt. We're talking about the land, right? The people they talk about in these ancient stories. We're talking about the Nile, Mississippi, all that stuff, man. Like, that was all here. Yeah, where's Little Egypt? Where's Little Egypt? Illinois, right? So, this so-called Egyptian resembles an American from the 14th century BC, which decided the carved or ceramic figure has high cheekbones, large almond eyes, and a prominent nose. Oh, prominent nose. Such a figure could be completely ignored, I suppose, except that John T.C. Heaviside argued many years ago, 1868, that Americans had influenced ancient Egypt. All right, we gone over the info already, guys. Where did the uh, three Egyptians, right? Who's the ancestors of the so-called Egyptians, and who influenced them? Many people have already talked about it, as he just said. So he was saying that Americans had influenced ancient Egypt. And more recently, Stephen C. Jett has written about evidence of nicotine tobacco leaves being found in the cadavers of ancient Egyptian mummies. All right. So that's something that's kind of known now, well known now. I remember when I was young that they were talking about this. So you can see how old this book is, guys. So we are a little more updated with the research right now. We're a lot further in time, in chronology, and a lot of information has come out. We're able to get more information than before. Now that the internet's out and people can travel a lot easier now. So this is how old this book is. And he's saying recently they found, they had tobacco, and not only tobacco, cocaine, right? Cocaine and the mummies, so-called mummies of Egypt. Where did they really get those mummies from? So they found tobacco leaves being found in the cadavers of ancient Egyptian mummies. Tobacco's native to America, guys, such as that of Ramses II, millennium BC. All right, Ramses, huh? Where was ancient Egypt really? He had tobacco leaves. Did you guys know that? Samples of mummies at the Munich Egyptian Museum of ages from 1070 BC to 395. I'm sorry, CE. Wait, what is this? Oh yeah, BC to 395 AD were found to contain both nicotine and cocaine. Nicotine and cocaine. Jed also presents data suggesting that cocaine and nicotine have been found in mummies from parts of Europe and Nubia, as well as Egypt, all dating to ancient times. Since both nicotine and cocaine, appear to be of American origin, their appearance in Egyptian mummies suggests early trading expeditions to the region from America. Again, from America. How else is that going to get over there? Let's be smart. Early contacts between America and Italy are also suggested by wall paintings uncovered in the Roman port city of Pompeii, a municipality covered over in an eruption of Mount Vesuvio on August 24th of 79. The painting includes a portrait of a husband and a wife. The man is very Mexican looking, with brownish skin. Brownish skin, high cheekbones, large semi-Asiatic eyes, and dark hair. He also has a very scanty mustache and very sparse beard, perhaps added later by a graffiti artist. He is definitely not Mediterranean in appearance. Although his wife appears Italian, he also does not remind one of a North African or Middle Easterner in general. Another mosaic from Vesuvius area around Pompeii appears to feature representations in color of a pineapple. All right. So these are all future videos we're going to show these sources and what they're talking about. We've shown representations of corn all over the ancient world, in the Hindu statues and in ancient China, in Europe, in Babylon, in ancient Egypt, hieroglyphics. Corn is all over there. We've shown that. Many corn videos. Make sure to catch up if you haven't checked those out. Those are great videos. All my corn videos. I love doing those videos. You learn so much just by following corn. It proves America's the true old world. We feed the world. Without corn, corn is literally what helped people settle down and become civilized. Agriculture. Corn was so easy to grow and it was exclusive to a certain people. All right. Now, apart from corn, they're finding, again, pineapples in Europe and Asia. That's all American. Red chili peppers, both American fruits, along with several lemons and a rooster or large hen. Again, these are all American animals. The banana or pineapple would have been from South America, while the peppers could have been from the Caribbean as well. Thus, again, we are justified in suggesting ancient American contact. the relationship of such possible journeys to the spread of syphilis will be discussed below. In the context of art, it is interesting that by the 19th century, scholars noticed that this is from Roman times, a bronze statue housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris very much resembled an indigenous American. Now, this is not just him saying it. We actually read the primary source. In connection with my research, I located the bronze and photographed it because it does indeed resemble a native of the Americas. It so happens that this bronze may well reflect an actual visit by Indians to northern Italy, and in all probability, to Rome. In this case, the bronze probably does not represent a Roman visit to America. First, because of the navigational difficulties presented. Again, remember, the currents are stronger going that way. And second, because we have a specific record of Indians reaching Europe in the same period that the bronze was produced. And that's what he was talking about. So there's a bronze statue that was made during that time, and there's a reference of Americans being washed ashore in the same period. That's what we did a video on. Make sure to check that out. At the current time, the bronze in question is labeled vase en forma de tête. Leme après j'ai si l'aspect physique du personnage particulier marqué. It is from the collection Dinan, all right? This is the collection, if you guys are interested. The collection Dinan, 1825, in the Louvre Museum, all right? Thus, a bust of an African woman, rather small, is located next to a vase or container in the form of a head, 2nd to 3rd century, with the physical aspect of the personage being particularly marked. In 1859, Professor Emil Eger argued that the Indians who had reached the Roman world in 60 BC, to be discussed below, were Caribs from America, all right? Caribs from America, all right? When Caribs from America, other individuals of American race, all right? Caribs, they're saying it was Caribs. He also voiced the opinion that the ancient bronze head found in the galleries of the Louvre represented one of those Indians, and that it was a reproduction of a type of the American race. In 1868, the existence of the bronze was publicized in a catalog of ancient bronzes belonging to the Louvre. Another French authority also felt that the bronze resembled an American of the type portrayed by the art of George Catlin. Paul Gaffaro concludes, at the very first look, everything in this bronze makes us think of the red race of the New World. All right, we got the primary source, we read it. The skull is dolichocephalous, receding forehead, long and low ears, strongly arched brows, aquiline nose, big lips, round lower maxilla. The total impression is striking. Very well. This is the type of American, and of American of the United States. So that's his opinion. He's saying, no, it's not a Carib. It's actually from North America. So they're all saying it looks like an American. They don't know from where. They don't know what tribe. All right. But yeah, they like, hey, these look like the American Indians. Not everyone has agreed that the bronze represent an American of 60 BC. All right. So Gaffarel, 1882, said that it was a hazardous conjecture to assume that the bronze was of one of the Indians arriving in the 60 BC, even though he believed that it portrayed an American. So even though he said it's not one of those that came in 60 BC, but it is an American. All right, either way, it's still American. Jeffrey Ashe also doubted the connection, believing that the bronze appeared more Roman than Red Indian. What is a Roman look? Where was the true ancient Rome? You know, we give Rome and Greece a lot of history. When we actually start going into the real chronology, guys, these are all future videos, you're going to see that a lot of the Roman and Greek history is kind of exaggerated, glorified, you know, and they didn't have, you know, who are the actual real Romans, the so-called Greeks. Things we're going to keep digging on and researching And it's all going to lead to the real Rome. All the roads are going to lead to the real Rome. He described the object as a bucket situla in the form of a human head. The projection on top is the handle, and the cranium is hinged to open like a lid. It might possibly be a divining urn. William H. Tillingsgast, 1889, was aware of the bronze but regarded its identification with an American as purely arbitrary. The association of the idea of a divining urn with a possible American head is intriguing, since it could indicate that as early as 2,000 years ago, the Romans began to associate mystical or spiritual matters with Native American or American Indians. Could it be that the American spiritual person reached Europe and became a practitioner there? Such a theory may seem far-fetched, but the dissemination of ideas, folktales, and other cultural traits often depends upon such strange arrivals in the various ages of world history. All right, so guys, this is what they're talking about right here. So this author actually went to the museum and took a picture of it. All right, so it says bronze head of a man with an American physical type in the Louvre Museum. All right, my own judgment is that if one covers over the ears on the bronze, which are perhaps excessively large in order to provide balance to the work of art, one sees an indigenous American face, one with a combination of features found in many parts of North, Central, and South America. Now let us proceed to examine the documentary evidence relating to American visits to Europe in the Roman and Teutonic periods. The initial source is a description of the world written by Pomponius Mela during the reign of Emperor Claudius, 41 to 94 AD, probably written in 44 AD. Mela, in the process of discussing a then current theory, attributed to Homer that the Indian Ocean possessed a direct connection with the North and Baltic seas, introduced relevant information as follows. All right. And so we actually read this when we talked about the Americans being washed ashore, right? We were talking about this person right here, Cornelius Nepos, what he said about his friend. Now it says Cornelius Nepos, a more recent and therefore more authoritative author, adds the testimony of Quintus Metellus Celer. Remember, these are Romans on this point, and says that he gave the following account. When he was governor of Gaul, some Indians were given to him by the king of the Boii. On asking where they had come from to these lands, their present whereabouts, he learned that they had been driven from the Indian seas by violent storms and finally come ashore in Germany. All right, so they're not talking about Hindustan, guys. How do you get from Hindustan all the way to Germany on a current? We're talking about from America. India Superior. North America was India Superior. It wasn't called North America. Most references to America was actually South America, guys. Check out my origin of the video, the name America. North America was actually referenced as India Superior, or the Greater China, the Greater India, Greater, Superior. Why would they call it superior if it's not the superior? Thus, an author of greater authority, Cornelius Nepos, asserted that Quintus Metellus Celer, when preconsul of Gaul, told him that he received some Indos, from the king of the Boii, a Celtic people located in present-day France and also farther east, perhaps to Bohemia, who asserted that they were driven by a storm to the coast of Germany, which they could reach to the Rhine area of the Netherlands from the seas of India. Other versions of Mela's text state that the Indians were delivered to Celer by the king of the Suevi, a wandering Germanic-speaking people located in the region of the Netherlands, North Germany, and or northern France and Belgium, and closely associated with the Sequani, a Celtic-speaking group. Unfortunately, the geographical work of Cornelius Nepos is lost, but he seems to have obtained his information on the Indians from Celer directly. The event apparently occurred in the period around 62 BC. 62 BC, Americans navigating or being shipwrecked in Europe. This is way before Vikings, way before any Europeans coming over here, way before Columbus. So I'm trying to tell you something here big. Columbus was never lost. He knew where he was going. We've done videos on that. The Vatican knew America was here. Everybody knew America was here. A later Roman writer who died in 79 AD, Claudius Pliny, or Pliny, right, also had access to Nepos' writing, telling us the same Nepos relates the following with regard to the northern passage. Indians were given as a gift to Quintus Metellus Celer, who was a colleague of Afranius. Yes, Africa is a Roman word. Africa was a colony, a Roman colony in Tunisia. And it's also a surname, all right? So who was the colleague of Afranius in the consulship, but at this time governor of Gaul, by the king of the Suevi? The Indians had been sailing from India on a trading mission, but had been carried off to Germany by storms. This information was provided by Pliny in connection with his discussion of the supposed marine connection between India and the north of Europe, all right? And we're not talking about Hindustan. That's what it was called back then, Bharat, Hindustan, not India. We're talking about India Superior, the real India Superior, North America. To understand the circumstances under which Mela and Pliny wrote, one must realize that everything to the east beyond India and in the island of Ceylon was only vaguely known to Romans, and that it is likely that any people thought to have been derived from Asia east from the Indus Valley to China and Japan would have been regarded as Indians. In later centuries, as we shall see, all parts of Asia east of the Ganges River were called India Extra, Gangem, India beyond the Ganges, and all persons found in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, China, and Japan regarded as being Indians, as were the Americans from 1492. What the Roman geographers did not realize was that the oceanic connection between the Indian Ocean and Northern Europe did not exist except by way of the North Pacific and the Arctic Sea. Thus, the Indians of 62 BC could not have come from the east as they imagined. Instead, they came from the India of Columbus. Not Columbus, he didn't name it that, all right? India Superior, which was, of course, America. Mela's 44 AD map of the world shows Germania extending from the Rhine River eastward. It also has India as a very large area of the southeast corner of Eurasian continent. The Ganges River in Ceres, China, face an ocean where the Pacific exists, but the latter connects directly northerly with a Scythian Ocean that in turn reaches to the Hyperborean Caspian Sea and the Britannicus Oceanus. Scandinavia is completely distorted in shape. Mela's map resembles that of Strabo, 9 BC to 21 AD, adding some detail in the Baltic, but also adding many fabulous groups such as Amazons near the Caspian people with the hooves of horses and so forth. Strabo incidentally argued that the Atlantic was navigable and that one could sail west from Spain to India. So remember, so it's not that they were trying to get to Hindustan when they were saying we're trying to get to India. They were literally talking about America. As taught by his predecessors, Eratosthenes, Mela doesn't seem to have considered that possibility. All right, so shout out to Con Drop. Amazing research on his channel when it comes to India Superior, the lands of Prester John, Cathay, Cipango, the original China, Japan. European geographers later come to realize that India, America, and the Pacific, East Asia, East Indian region could be reached directly by sailing westward from Europe. But apparently both Mel and Pliny were not conversant with ideas of voyages to and from the west, as was the case earlier with Strabo and the days of the Atlantis story. So yeah, again, shout out to Drop for we're talking about the three Indias. there was references of 3 Indias in these ancient writings. There wasn't just one India. The clerical historian Francisco Lopez de Gomara, writing in the 1550s, was skeptical of the notion which still persisted in his day, and in spite of the maps of Claudius Ptolemy, that one could sail from Scandinavia into East Asia through cold, freezing waters, as Lopez put it, by way of the north of that peninsula. He noted that there were no memories among the ancients of anyone traveling by such a route, with one exception of the Nepos Seller account. Lopez concludes his remarks by saying of the latter Indians, si ya no fuesen de tierra del labrador y los tuviesen por indianos, engañados en el color. Thus, he seems to favor the ideas that the visitors were Americans from Labrador, Newfoundland, taken for Indianos. Oh, he's saying they're calling these American Indians Indianos, the new Spanish name for Asian Indians, because of their color. Because of their color? Immediately thereafter, Lopez discusses the arrival of other Indians at Lubeck in the 12th century. His exact language is, if on that occasion they would not be from Labrador, and they would hold them to be Indians, deceived by the color, not a bit of it. Besides, they say that in the days of the Emperor Federico Barbarossa, certain Indios made port at Lubeck in a canoe. Thus, Lopez expresses doubt that the Indians came around via Scandinavia, in spite of the promotion of such route by his contemporary Olaus Godos. Olaus Magnus, a clerical refugee from the Swedish Reformation who died in 1558. I will suggest that the Indians, in parentheses, must have been from America, since the arrival of Sami Lapps, Finns, Russians, or other Northern Europeans is unlikely to have existed in any special notice. Mella, for example, knew of the Hyperboreans, by which name he referred to such people as the Sami, Finns, Karelians, and North Baltic people. The Romans had already visited the Cimbri, now Denmark, Cimmerians, remember? And had entered the Baltic. The Teutonic nations of that region were trading and skirmishing with Rome, and Roman coins have been found in Denmark from the 1st century AD. Thus, it would seem virtually certain that the term Indians was used for a totally strange people, probably with long hair, long dark hair, and very brown skin. All right? Remember, this is what Indian meant. This is what I'm trying to tell you guys. This is what Indian meant. Are you very brown skinned? What is absolutely certain is that European geographers of the 15th century, when reading of Nepos Indians, assumed that these Indians had crossed the Atlantic from the west. Such was the opinion of Pope Pius II, when, as Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, he wrote his Historia Rerum with de Asia in circa 1461. Christopher Columbus was directly inspired by the belief that Indians had sailed easterly to Europe, and indeed wrote in the margins, as noted previously, of Silvius' history, that he had seen 2 such persons in Galway, Ireland, coming from the west. All right, if you missed those videos, yes, Columbus met American Indians before he even came to America in the 1470s, 20 years before he sailed to America. So he wasn't lost, guys. So when you're coming to me and trolling, and I'm not talking to the real ones out here, guys. I'm talking to the people. It's like, we don't call ourselves Indians. That's Columbus named us. The white man named us. First of all, Columbus wasn't so-called white, pale skin. He was a Sephardic Portuguese Jew, Marrano, Moorish. Columbus knew. He met Indians in Ireland, right, in the 1470s. Make sure to catch up on the videos. Aeneas Silvius wrote, Plinius Nepotis, Testimonio Utipor. All right, I'm not reading the Latin. Let's go to the translation. Thus he quotes Pliny about the Indians being templates blown to the coast of Germany on a trading mission. He then goes on to add the information about Indians reaching Germany in the 12th century, which will be discussed below. Together, these instances lead him to say, in some manner, the greater part of the Northern Ocean is congealed frozen and not navigable, but away from the columns of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, all right, that's in Morocco and Spain, right? When you leave the Mediterranean into the Atlantic Ocean, that's the Straits of Gibraltar. Mauritania, Hispania, Iberia, and Gaul form a circuit, and nearly all west is navigable. The east is unknown to us. He said, we don't know what's in the east, but we know if you go that way, you're going to run into so-called Indians or, the true old land. Thus, Sylvius was aware that the Atlantic Ocean was navigable. He was also aware that the distance to the east coast of Asia, where Indians, right, lived, we're talking about indigenous people of America, lived, was an immense one going easterly, due probably to the travels of Europeans to China and greater knowledge of India beyond the Ganges. Since the earth was seen as a globe by such thinkers, some contemporaries began to realize that the quickest route from Europe to India was directly west. That is, the far east and the far west were one and the same. Again, the farthest east, that's over here. The farthest west, that's over here. So when Marco Polo went to the farthest east, which they haven't found where he went, guys, they haven't proven where Marco Polo traveled to meet the Grand Khan. They can't find that today. He actually came over here and he met the Prester. Yeah, he met the Dawid, King David, the Grand Khan. Again, the Far East and the Far West were one and the same. Since America was unknown as a large continent, but was merely known, if all at all, as islands, Atlantis, the work of Sylvius influenced the geographer Paolo Toscanelli and Columbus, and part of that influence consisted in the references to Indians being blown by storm to the European coast. Sylvius, after citing Pliny, goes on to inform us that one Otto, probably Otto of Freysen, indicated that during the reign of one of the German emperors, a boat and Indian traders were caught on the German coast, to which place, from an unwelcome contrary wind from the east, blowing constantly, they arrived accidentally. All right. So again, guys, there's many sources and references, right, to these so-called Indians, American indigenous people, washing up over there in ancient times in Europe, way before Vikings and anybody came over here. Okay. Many references when we start actually doing the research. So this Otto, right? That's what he's saying too. This event seemingly occurred in the 1160s or thereabouts, and perhaps was localized in the West Baltic or in the Friesland region between Denmark and the Netherlands. But we are also informed by the Spanish writer Lopez de Gomara, as noted, that was in Spanish. Well, we got this earlier, actually. He already translated this. Thus, Lopez reports from his sources that in the time of Emperor Frederick I of Barbarossa, a canoe load of Indians reached Lubeck, a Wendic Slavic port of East Holstein, which had been conquered and refounded by Saxons and Frisian merchants in 1138 to 43 AD. He went on to tell the reader about Aeneas Sylvius' continuing belief in an ocean connection from Scandinavia to India, and then to relate the belief of Olaus Magnus about the possibility noted above of sailing to China from northern Norway. Sailing to China, right? The real China. Katai. Yeah. Were these the same Indians as reported by Otto of Freysen, or were they a second group perhaps following up on trade opportunities? Since Lubeck was already a major trading center, it is possible that they were encouraged to go there after initially landing somewhere else. In any case, Paul Gaffro interprets Lopez de Gomara as saying that the Indians of Celler and Lubeck could be from America. Who knows if the Indians of Metellus Celler were not Americans from Labrador? Translates Gaffaro. but note my own earlier translation of Lopez, which is somewhat different. Another early writer, Cornell Whitfield, stated that the Indians could not come from the farthest Orient or Occident, but that they were from Labrador. We're talking about Newfoundland, from Estoitiland. All right, that's what they called it, or other neighboring country. And one who knows about differences in climate would concur with me. Whitfield also wrote in his History Universal de Indies. All right, let's get to the translated part. In short, he believed that Indians of Cellar and Lubeck were from the Labrador, Newfoundland region, and he adds that Paolo Giovio, an Italian historian and cleric, was of the same opinion. But in addition, he is said to have offered the notion that Americans were coming to England and France to capture people for human sacrifice. Oh man, dodge the hijack. So they'd go all the way over there just to get humans for sacrifice. They had people over here they can grab. They had enemies. They had people they didn't want from their communities. So that's the hijack with the whole sacrifice thing. A more accurate source would seem to be that of Antonio Galvano, who wrote in circa 1555. In the year 1153, in the time of Frederic Barbarossa, it is written that there came to Lubeck one canoa with certain Indians, like unto a long barge, which seemed to have come from the coast of Bacalaos, Newfoundland region, the Cod Island, Cod Sea. The Germans greatly wondered to see such a barge and such people, not knowing from whence they came, nor understanding the speech, especially because there was then no knowledge of that country. And now there is, it may be credible that though the boat was small in respect of those huge seas, yet the winds and water might bring them thither. Those who have suggested that the Indians of Cellar and Lubeck might have been Sami, Finns, or other Northern European people have failed. Those people don't do research. I think to understand the extent of trade and commerce that must have already existed throughout the Baltic and the multilingual capacities that would have resulted. British scholars have, for example, demonstrated that over a period of several thousand years, during the life of the Stonehenge Sacred Circle, that part of Britain, as well as Ireland and Brittany, and even more remote regions were in regular contact. During the century prior to our own era, Romans were in contact with large areas of the southern Baltic Rim, as noted earlier, as well as specifically with the Cimbri Peninsula, Denmark, and Holstein. All right. Now, remember what we read about Denmark, or the Mark of Dan. Denmark or Denmark, Danites. Who's the Danites? Where the Danites come from? They come from Canaan. Canaan is the Holy Land, or is the true Holy Land, the true Promised Land. We just talking about ancient America. So you guys understand there has been trade. He's right. There has been trade since ancient times. It seems logical to assume that the existence of Sami, Finns, Slavic groups, and other Baltic people would be known, and that one could find individuals in Gaul or the Rhine region who could translate from the many Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and Finno-Ugric languages of the region, as well as even pre-Indo-European tongues still spoken in Roman times. Tacitus, 90 AD, and Procopius, 530 to the 50s AD, both were aware of the Finni or Lapps. Tacitus described the Finni as being hunters with skins for clothing. Skins, all right, skins for clothing. Procopius was aware of many Sami-Lapp customs. It would seem likely that the Sami or Sami of the period were basically similar in physical type to other Northern Europeans, except for stature, and that they would hardly be mistaken for Indians. Slavic peoples, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Phoenicians, Karelians were doubtless also part of the Baltic trading world. And this would be especially true by the 1100s. Lubeck at that time was in the state of transition from Wendic Slavic ascendancy to Germanic dominance, and the trading center must have been very multilingual. Paul Gaffro A careful student of these matters summed up the situation of both the Roman and Teutonic contacts by stating, therefore, it seems that the Greeks and Romans never went to America. On the contrary, there are Americans who during the first century before the Christian era might have come to Europe. Of course, we are talking about the unintended trips of some Americans brought by storm onto the European shores, all right? So, that's the hijack with that, and it's not just from shipwrecks. We were navigating over there. Again, who's the so-called Phoenicians, Danites, and all these people, all right? Where's the true Canaan? These trips are very much disputed. However, if they are not proved, they are at least very likely. After discussing other examples of Americans reaching European waters, Gaffrel goes on to say, therefore, it is quite possible that the winds brought some Americans to the European coast. For the distance in between is not so important that it cannot be traversed in a short time. In this connection, he cites the story of the Marquis de la Roche, who in a small boat was driven by a storm from Sable Island, Canada, to France in a very short time. You hear that? This was happening a lot, guys. Trust me. He also cites other examples of native travel that we will discuss below. But perhaps the most important evidence is found in the opinions of Christopher Columbus. All right, so-called Columbus. What's his real name? Oh, we got so many videos coming. As he wrote in the margins of Pierre de Ailly, Imago Mundi, written in 1420, Pliny's Natural History, and especially Aeneas Sylvius Historia from 1477. Most of Columbus' marginal notes in those works were written in the 1481-90 period, and they reveal the importance of the American visits to Europe. Columbus was frequently impressed by evidence presented in both the Ailly and Sylvius that India and Iberia, Hispanium, were not very distant, sailing westward from the latter. For example, Columbus wrote marginally in Imago Mundi. All right, this is what Columbus is writing. The sea that separates Spain, Iberia, and India is small. The Ailly went on to say, as Columbus interpreted, India is at the extremity of the east, and the end of the west is properly the extremity of Spain. The Ailly also wrote that India is immensely large and has 118 peoples. Well, we have way more than that, right? Columbus' marginal note reiterates that it is the third part of the habitable world. And India Gentis, India has 118 nations, not people. The Ailly continues that from the extremity of Spain and the beginning of India, it is an area that is not great. Columbus writes marginally, India is near Spain. Columbus also wrote marginal notes in Pliny's Natural History. About 861 notes were placed in his copy of Sylvius Historia. For example, Columbus writes, all right, all these translations, it says, that is, the author states that all of the Northern Sea is navigable, and the author states that boats coming from the Indies, West Indies, Indias, that contain humans and merchandise reach Germany. Columbus then goes on to write, that is, if the distance was extremely great between Germany and India, the boat could not have make the journey without mishap. Moreover, it proved that two countries are close. It is at this point that Colon goes on to describe his directly witnessing the arrival of two Americans in Galway, Ireland in 1477. Again, Columbus met Indians, American Indians in Ireland before he came, so he was never lost, guys. All right? Break out of that. As discussed in chapter 1, make sure to catch up to the videos. We read chapter 1 already. People from Catayo, right? People from Catay, towards the east they came. From the east they came. From the west they traveled east, right? Towards the east. They traveled towards the east and they ended up in Europe. From Catay, Catayo, the original Catay. Yeah, original. Shout out to Drop. We saw many notable things, especially in Galway, Ireland, of a man and wife of marvelous form with two dugouts logs in their possession. After this most important statement, Columbus goes on to add, that is, the author, Sylvius, says that the Northern Ocean is not congealed nor innavigable. The east for us is unknown. However, the ancients claim that someone has navigated there. From French translation, even if ancients went forth navigating. Continuing says, in short, not only did Columbus personally witness the arrival of Americans in Ireland, all right, not only did he witness the arrival of Americans in Ireland, so how was he lost? But he clearly interpreted the information from Pliny and Sylvius as referring to people crossing the Atlantic. Of course, there are other reasons for Colon's opinion, such as the references to boats reaching the Azores from the west, as discussed below, along with carved wood objects and deceased humans of non-European and non-African type. There is also additional evidence of which Columbus' sources were unaware. A very prominent writer of books about maritime life, Jean Marion, has provided us with two references to the arrival of American on the west coast of Spain or neighboring Portugal. Marion states in Lonely Voyagers, in the Middle Ages there arrived one day on the coast of Spain a man red, right? The red man, or rouge, a red man, and strange, very strange, and a craft described as a hollow tree, that's a canoe. From the recorded description, which specifically says that he was not a Negro, he might well have been a Native American in Piragua, a dugout boat, all right? Dodge the hijack. Remember, Indian, a strange people with very dark brown complexion. So-called Negro, right? Unfortunately, the man died before he learned to speak the local language. He had been put in the care of religious fraternity who carried him off to their bishop so that he might be instructed and baptized. The journey was too much for him. Shortly thereafter, Marion wrote a book on Christopher Columbus in which he states, according to the Chronicle, a man had been found alive on the coast of Portugal and had died without having been able to make himself understood, though he was taken to the bishop. Unfortunately, Marion does not tell us which chronicle he used, and my efforts to trace his sources have been fruitless. However, it would seem that the red man arrived either in Galicia or the Oporto region, where the border of Spain and Portugal was obscure due to the fact that Spain did not then exist as a state and Portugal only emerged gradually between 997 and 1143 AD. I would think that Marion is referring to this general period because after the 1150s, the distinction between Portugal and Galicia, Leon and Castile, would be clearer. Occasionally, artifacts have been turned up in Europe that suggest visits by Americans. These include harpoon heads of possibly Inuit origin, found in Ireland and Scotland from much the same period just discussed, as well as numerous kayaks of somewhat later date. These will be considered in the next chapter in connection with the northern or Inuit route from America to Europe. But here it is necessary to examine 4 baked clay masks, now housed in the Pitt Rivers Museums of Oxford University. The ceramic heads in question are called masks because of their lacking a back, being only rather thick representations of the front of a face. They lack eye slits, however, and therefore were perhaps never intended to be worn by humans as in a dance or ceremony. They may have been funerary masks, used in some American cultures to cover the head of the deceased or otherwise to represent the deceased. They were perhaps originally painted, but most of the paint has disappeared except for traces. The masks are described by English observers as grotesque and seem unlikely to have been the kind of object that would be brought to England by a collector or by a dealer in the antiquities. Now let us review their provenance and history so far as I have been able to discover. In 1884, Julian Pitt Rivers acquired 2 ceramic items as part of the original collection of artifacts. They were described as grotesque, death heads, face, and a coarse pottery, classified as figures, religion. At a much later date, 1984, they were labeled as Aztec and said to be from Mexico. by Elizabeth Baquedano of the Institute of Archaeology, London University. They were cataloged as 1884.67.83 and 1884.67.84. And these are the masks they have here, guys. Wow, those look like wow, they do look like the Central American and South American. Wow, I actually seen things like that here in the pottery and everything. So I've never read this part of the book, guys. So, this is all new to me too. It is not known from whom Pitt Rivers acquired the two heads. However, I will suggest that they came from Gloucester City, and specifically from an excavation in College Street in that city. In May 1883, the Gloucester Journal reported that College Street was to be widened. It is proposed to take down the houses on the eastern side of the street and re-erect a row of more imposing-looking buildings. At the same time, the street was to be widened, but a picturesque ancient gateway on the west side would not be changed. The widening would provide a carriage route to the cathedral, as it was the street is a miserable lane, so narrow that there is barely room for one vehicle to pass along it at a time. All this might mean very little except that a very similar, perhaps identical, head turned up as a result of an excavation in College Court, an alley very close to College Street and also leading to the cathedral area. John Rose, then director of the Gloucester City Museum, informed me that the College Court head was probably found prior to 1930 and could even go back to the 1860s when the museum was open. The museum had held the object for years, but there was no accession date or any other records of acquisition. They were literally hiding it. The city also had no record of any excavation in College Court. Mr. Rose earlier had written to me that the College Court head and one found at Bull Lane to be discussed occurred in the city center, which has been occupied more or less continuously from Roman times to the present day, and in any open ground, such as in this case, the Bull Inn Garden, was used for burying rubbish from medieval times up to the mid-19th century. Now, it says here on December 5th, 1967, Mr. Rose had sent to the Pitt Rivers Museum the head found in College Court referred to as a grotesque mask. He said that it is one of two found in building sites in Gloucester. Hitherto, we have regarded them as possibly medieval local products. But yesterday, a visitor told me that he had seen similar object in your galleries labeled as Mexican Death Mask. If the enclosed really is of foreign origin, please do not trouble to return it. A reply was made on December 18, in which Mr. Rose was informed by Beatrice Blackwood that the mask certainly bears a close resemblance to a specimen described in our catalog as Death Heads, Mexico. It is one of the original Pitt River specimens and has no further documentation, and the resemblance even extends to the traces of white paint. It therefore seems likely that your mask does indeed come from Mexico. Objects as exotic have been found on British sites, though how they got there remains a mystery. On June 6, 1968, Mr. Rose sent the other Gloucester head to the Pitt Rivers, this one being the one found in excavations of 1951 at the site of the Bull Inn, as mentioned above. A few days later, Miss Blackwood responded that she had taken the first mask to the Ashmolean Museum to show it to the medieval specialist. The latter stated that they do not know of anything remotely like them from medieval England. The resemblances between both of your specimens and the two Mexican Death Heads masks we have are so detailed and striking that I have no doubt. He said he has no doubt, or she says, that they are in fact Mexican or from Mexico. All right? This is stuff they don't teach us, guys. They never told me this in elementary school, middle school, high school, and they don't teach this in college. We shall be pleased to give them a home among our Mexican antiquities. Unfortunately, the two new masks were mixed up so that it became impossible by the 1990s to tell which one was from College Court and which from Bull Inn. However, we do have a clue in that court head was mentioned as still having traces of white paint. The number 1977.15.1 has been assigned to one with much paint. Number 1977.15.2 is described as a very worn, cracked, and mended. Number 1977.15.1 is virtually identical to 1884 6783, also with paint. So perhaps now the reader will understand why I feel that the original pit riverhead stemmed from Gloucester, also from the College Street location that is very close to College Court and also to the Bull Inn location. Now, as to the Bull Inn find, the 1951 report of the Gloucester City Museum states that a careful watch was kept for any possible traces of Roman buildings. When the foundations for the extension of the telephone exchange were dug in the area between Bull Lane and Berkeley Street, a quantity of medieval and some Roman pottery was collected from this site. Any traces of Roman buildings must have been destroyed by the medieval pits that had been dug right down into the natural sand. Mrs. D.N. Reaney, an archaeologist, had joined the staff in June 1951. A report of medieval pottery from Bull Lane, Gloucester, was prepared by someone at the museum. It states that when the foundation for the telephone exchange building were dug, a square of about 20 feet was completely excavated by hand to a depth of 10 feet, and further excavation by hand took place in part of the area. Pits several feet deep, which contained pottery of medieval, written in dates, as well as Roman pottery ranging from 2nd to 4th century, were seen to have been cut into it. The medieval pits had evidently been cut through through Roman levels. It adds that as much pottery as could be rescued without delaying the men working was collected and has been placed in the Gloucester City Museum. The Mexican ceramic head was found as a part of this collection of medieval and Roman materials. In a letter, D.N. Reaney states that the area dug up was not really done by hand, but by pick and shovel instead of mechanical excavator. She kept watch in case any remains of Roman buildings should be discovered, in which case we should have tried to make records of it. The site seemed of sufficient importance to carry out some archaeological investigation. Continuing, I interviewed Ms. Reaney on May 6, 1994 in Oxford. She stated that she was primarily a Roman specialist and was principally looking for Roman ruins below ground level. As I recorded in my notes from the interview, workers worked by hand, found rubbish pits, Roman layers of pottery, and medieval layers. The medieval material was stored in museum basement, including the mask. She didn't pay any attention to that material. John Rhodes, who came to the museum in 1962, stated that a box of dwarfware, slipware of the 17th and 18th centuries, was also found at the Bull Inn site, but she was not present at the excavation. In any case, it would seem that the mask was associated with a medieval rubbish pit. According to the person who was present, Mrs. Reaney. Still further, Rhodes himself believed that the mask was of local medieval origin, as stated in his letter to the Pit Rivers of December 5, 1967. The Bull Inn was a famous Gloucester inn built at an unknown date, but probably before 1600. According to T.G. Hassel of the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, the site was previously occupied by a college of priests or priest tenements during the time of Henry III, up to and beyond 1455. The college was suppressed by Edward VI, 1537 to 1553, after Henry VIII's order of 1536. Rubbish was buried in back gardens throughout the Gloucester city center, such as behind the college and later Bull Inn. Bull Lane, on which the inn was located, was called Gore Lane in the Middle Ages. In 1455, the lane included several tenements of abbots and priors, and then the chaplain and proctors of the service of the Blessed Mary in the Church of the Holy Trinity hold diverse tenements, wherein diverse priests dwell, as in a college held of the abbot of St. Peter of Gloucester, which in this time of King Henry III, from 1207 to 1272, were called the land of Thomas Campais, and also afterwards. At about that time, 1450, New Inn was constructed not far away to house pilgrims who came to visit the shrine of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral, then the Abbey Church of St. Peter. New Inn still survives, at least in part. The priest's college was suppressed soon after 1536 to 1537, and the Bull Inn was doubtless built on the site soon after. One can argue that the medieval rubbish pits were probably filled up during the period of the college occupancy, since material from the Bull Inn period would hardly be considered medieval, I would think. In any case, we have two presumed Mexican masks, all right? Mexican masks. We have ancient masks from Mexico here. They're found and buried from medieval times here, guys, stemming from locations in medieval contexts, with the likelihood of four such masks buried in adjacent but diverse parts of the city center. How did they get to Gloucester? And at what date? Why were they buried in different locations? That's a good question. At my request, the Oxford University Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art carried out tests on two Gloucester museums masked for the Pitt Rivers Museum. The results indicated that, and that's the number 1977.15.1, is between 550 and 900 years from last firing. So from 1093 to 1443 AD. And that the other, and that's the number right there, is between 300 and 500 years from the last firing, 1493 to 1677 AD. This would seem to indicate that the four masks in question, since one of 1884 is identical with, and that's the number, perhaps were created in 1400 to 1500 period, or quite possibly prior to the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan. It would appear that the mask from College Court is very similar to 1884, 6783. I don't know these numbers, right? What's going on? Or maybe they meant 1883. I don't know. And that both were made by the same maker or from the same mold. Thus, it is unfortunate that we do not know how deep in the ground the mask was found, or even in what context. Nonetheless, general conditions would indicate that the mask arrived in Britain before 1550 to 1600, when Bull Inn was built, although a later date cannot absolutely be ruled out. Gloucester, a very ancient city, is located on the Severn River and has long been an important port. In 1877, 549 foreign ships and 3,762 British ships entered the port. Thus, it is a site that might have been reached by persons derived from a drifting American boat from Mexico or Mesoamerica, a boat that had, perhaps, entered the Irish Sea or Severn Estuary, but of course, a British or other ship might have brought the mask, but in either case, when and why? If we were to argue that the masks were brought from Mexico by a British subject, we face the difficulty to explaining why four somewhat rough and unspectacular ceramic objects would have been important enough to be smuggled past Spanish officials or stolen from a Spanish vessel, and why would they have been on a vessel in the first place? In the early and later 1500s, English ships were entering the Caribbean and more rarely going to Mexico. For example, in 1555, an English ship went to Haiti and Mexico, where they found Thomas Blake's, a Scotsman, who had dwelt there 20 years. The master and others were imprisoned and sent to Spain, but other voyages reached Mexico in 1564 and 1568. Most of these visits were hostile ones, especially during the Elizabethan period. One can imagine that a few spectacular or impressive Mexican objects might have reached Britain as a result of such activities, but I would argue that objects of purely ethnographic interest would not have been of enough value to steal or carry, at least until after Mexican independence in 1821 and the rise of 19th century antiquarianism. Before concluding, let us return to the question of the meaning and function of Mexican mask. According to Donald Cordry, an authority on Mexican folk culture, Mexican masks traditionally constitute a face or soul. Mexican Indian groups directly relate the face to the soul. Covering the face with a mask is the equivalent of temporarily removing the identity and soul, or alma, as I say so in Spanish, of the mask wearer from the everyday world. Masks substitute a new face, example, new ego, persona, and soul. Cordry is speaking especially of masks used in dances and ceremonies, but the soul concept also applies to death masks. The surviving clay and stone masks are commonly classified as mortuary masks, as they were usually discovered in tombs. Some of these masks have no eye holes and were probably specifically made for the dead. All of this splendid work may have been done so that the wearer could wake up comfortably after death in another world. Masks were often used for protection against evil, against illness, and funeral rites. Cordry knows that when mortuary bundles were the custom, a mass of stone, wood, or possibly copper was tied to the top of the bundle. The early Spanish observer, Jerónimo de Mendieta, noted, of the ceremonies with which they buried the lords and those who were not, all assembled together. They put the dead body in order, wrapping him up in 15 or 20 exquisite capes woven with a design. And when he was shrouded and his face covered, they placed a painted mask on top. It would seem that the Gloucester masks were either taken from excavation of Mexico burials or were brought by Mexicans to Britain. Again, the excavation process was probably not initiated until after 1821, although perhaps tomb robbing or looting might have been common in the early years of the conquest, but gold and other precious objects would have been sought. It is also possible that the Roman Catholic priests began to suppress the use of burials with soul masks soon after the Spanish conquest. But if the masks arrived in Gloucester in late medieval or pre-1519 times in the hands of American visitors, why would they have been carried across the Atlantic? I can only suggest two possibilities. One, that the mass had religious significance or described, and two, that the Mesoamericans expected that they might perish on their long voyage and wished to have death masks along with them for that event. Finally, of course, there is also the possibility that English vessels kidnapped or otherwise added Mexicans to their crews while in American waters, and that some of the latter somehow came to Gloucester with death masks in the 16th century. In any event, the finding of such objects raises important issues that must be dealt with, even if, at this stage, a certain explanation is not available. Americans continued to cross the Atlantic in the 15th and early 16th centuries. Bartolomé de las Casas, using Colón's notes and diaries, found that the latter had learned from Portuguese sources que en la isla de Flores, que es una de las Azores, había echado la mar dos cuerpos de hombres muertos que parecía tener las caras muy anchas y de otro gesto que tienen los cristianos. Thus Columbus was told that two bodies had been washed ashore in the Azores, of persons with very broad faces and features unlike those of Europeans. Moreover, otra vez, dice que el Cabo de la Verga y por aquella comarca se vieron almadias o canoas con casa movedira. All right, so that's all in Spanish. Let me get to the translation. It says, thus canoes or almadias, dug out like boats, with removable houses had by chance been blown by the winds to the Azores, while the original occupants had perished. The canoas were still afloat as they drifted from island to island. We do not know, of course, whether these Americans were on their way across the Atlantic in an eastward direction, or perhaps more likely had already been to European waters and were returning southwesterly, having become separated from the fastest moving section of the ocean stream. In any case, their adventures can perhaps be best understood by mentioning here the fate of the 7 Americans who in 1508 or 1509 were picked up by a French ship as they traveled in the North Atlantic somewhere between Newfoundland and Britain, as discussed in chapter 3. All right, remember we talked about this and read it in chapter 3. They were finding American Indians seafaring out in the ocean. These North Americans ended up in ruined France, at least for a time. But did they remain there, or did some return to their home country? The same question can be asked of the American man and woman met by Cologne and Galway in 1477, all right? Indians in Ireland before Columbus came to the Americas. He met them. Did they remain in Ireland, leaving an American genetic heritage, or did they manage to return home? Sometime in the early European contact period, prior to the English colonization, the Seawee people of coastal South Carolina set out on a boat to reportedly visit England. The vessel was apparently outfitted with sails, but unfortunately they were seized by an English ship out in the Atlantic and sold as slaves. All right, you guys hear what happened? So they found these Seawee Indians seafaring out in the Atlantic, these so-called English, right? And what happened? They enslaved them. They enslaved them. Not Africans, right? They enslaved them, sold as slaves, the Seawee Indians. All right. This was perhaps during the period prior to 1620, in which several English vessels captured Americans both along the New England coast and along the Rappahannock River in Virginia, transporting them as slaves to Europe. Okay. Talking about Indians being enslaved. How many more accounts, guys, do we have to go over until you start seeing the numbers? All right. They're not enslaving Africans. In any case, the fact that the Seawee set out on the Gulf Stream to visit England is a rather interesting confirmation of the possibility of intentional voyages to Europe by early Americans. We can be confident from all these examples of Americans reaching European waters or the Azores Islands that there must have been a large number of unrecorded visits both before and during this period, and that's a fact. Americans were seafaring way before, Europeans came here. And, of course, if they found a couple of them seafaring out in the ocean, how many didn't they find? How many actually made it, right, to Europe or Asia or Africa, right? In connection with this discussion, mention should be made of certain American traditions that point towards travel by sea to other lands. Modern Maya teachers and spiritual elders sometimes indicate that in ancient times, Mayas traveled to other parts of the world, including India and Egypt. Okay, who is the Nagas? Who are the Nagas? More ancient tradition relates to one Votan. All right, Votan, a culture hero of Chiapas, who is said to have been sent by divine authority to divide up the land among the Americans, and who introduced other aspects of later cultures. The oldest source, around 1690s to 1702, states that Wotan witnessed the Tower of Babel and was a grandson of Noah. All right, you guys hear that? Wotan, and change that V to a W, you get Wotan. Like Wotan, like Odin and Wotan, Scandinavian mythological deities, huh? Wotan. It says he was the grandson of Noah, huh? Wow, interesting, right? But this is clearly a post-conquest edition. I would think facilitated doubtless by the fact that the oldest source is from a Dominican who became Bishop of Chiapas and Soconusco in 1683. Later additions to Wotan, the story of century or more later, have been stemming from a land called Valum Votan, actually La Isla de Havana, which in the figurative language of the snakes is Volun Votan. All right, you guys hear that? You guys hear that? They try to always say, oh, Votan came from somewhere else, came from Europe, came from here, came from Africa, whatever. Look, they're telling you. He might have been in Havana or Cuba, La Isla Havana, which is in the figurative language of the snakes in Volun Votan. Votan claimed to be a snake, culebra, and a chivim. So what does he mean? You mean from the Khan dynasty? You mean an ancient Naga? Supposedly he conducted 7 families from Balum Votan to this continent. Subsequently, he made 4 voyages to Chivim, also visiting Spain, Rome, when the great house of God was being built, passing the houses of the 13 snakes. He did this apparently by following a road that his brother's snakes had bored in the earth. It is also said that Wotan visited a very old city where he witnessed the ruins, presumably of the Tower of Babel. Wow. Unfortunately, the Wotan material is so fragmentary and so mixed with ideas of a post conquest nature that it is impossible to know what the original belief might have been. But there does seem to be a tradition of overseas travel to Europe or at least to Caribbean islands. All right, at least to the Caribbean and the land of the snakes. The land of the snakes, huh? Interestingly, the Lenape people of North America in their epic Walam Olam speak of the snake land. The Lenape snake land may have been connected with the Great Serpent Mound of Ohio. The traditions of the Quiche of Guatemala point toward a migration from the Veracruz Tabasco region. In this context, three chiefs' sons resolved on a return journey to the east across the sea to where their fathers had led them from Tolan, Veracruz. They went to request certain insignia of royal authority from a Lord Naxit. This sea was perhaps the Laguna de Terminos of Tabasco, in my judgment, and not the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean. The original crossings of the sea was by means of stones piled up in the sand as the waters divided. The Mandan people of present day North Dakota are said to have had a tradition of going out upon the ocean and perhaps visiting Europe. I have not been able to find any written evidence of the latter, but recorded Mandan stories do refer to visiting the mouth of a major river, the Mississippi presumably, and of going out upon the ocean and visiting another land. One account states that the Mandan were in the habit of going to an island in the ocean of the mouth of a river to gather matabajo, big shells of many colors. For the journey, they used a boat by the name of Idihe, self-going. This boat carried 12 persons and no more. When they reached the ocean, they were confronted by a great whirlpool. So they kept on the journey until they came to a part of the ocean where the waves were rough. Upon the island, there were inhabitants under a chief named Manage or Manike. This account is said to be very similar to one recorded in the 1830s. Another version from 1929 states, the Mandan people originated at the mouth of this river, way down at the ocean. Unfortunately, it has been many centuries since ancient native traditions might have been recorded from nations residing along most coastal areas. In any case, the impact of visits to Europe may indeed be very great, embracing such diverse areas as genetic influences, the introduction of American plants, the possible introduction of drugs such as nicotine and cocaine, philosophical and cultural ideas, and even the spread of disease vectors. The disease of syphilis is a case in point. As many readers are aware, syphilis attacked the Spanish, Italian, and French armies in Italy in the 1490s in a very virulent form. At first, no one blamed Americans for this outbreak, and in fact, the Spaniards soon called the malady gallico, or the French disease. Nonetheless, by the middle of the 16th century, several Spanish writers began to identify the Caribbean region as the source for the contagion. Although none of the earliest reports mentioned the disease, in more recent times, some archaeologists and non-native historians have joined the chorus, the former seeing in some skeletal remains signs of syphilitic infection, the latter simply echoing Spanish writers. For my own part, I rather doubted the pre-1492 presence of the disease in America for several reasons. One, its total absence in the reports of all early diaries that I have examined from North America, as well as the Caribbean. Two, the seemingly complete lack of fear on the part of white persons about having intercourse with American women or men. All right, that's the hijack. European persons, not just pale-skinned people, right? There were also black Europeans that came and mixed with American women. Three, No description of infected individuals known to me at early contact. 4. The fact that Baja and Upper Californian natives were highly susceptible to the disease after contact, with less resistance than evidenced by Spaniards. And 5. The massive death rates of Americans after contact with Spaniards throughout the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and South America, indicating susceptibility to more than one disease vector that was new to America. And researching my book, Africans and Native Americans, all right, great book we've read many times, and we're going to continue reading. I discovered a note of Pedro Martir de Angleria from April 1488, in which he refers to syphilis, which he states is called bubas in Spain and Gallico in Italy. The combination of the terms Gallico and bubas makes it certain that he was referring to syphilis and not to some other disease. Thus, 3 years before Columbus, right, sailed west, syphilis was present in Spain. Now we know that syphilis was epidemic, and at least some parts of England, long before 1492. The Port of Hull possessed an Augustinian priory that has been investigated archaeologically. 60% of the skeletons unearthed have revealed signs of acute syphilitic infection, dating between 1300 and 1420, principally in the 1340s to 1369. The destruction of bones, including skulls, forehead, legs, and so on, was much more severe than the kind of lesions found in America, thus suggesting perhaps that Americans possessed a much milder form of the disease, if indeed it existed at all prior to Columbus' voyage. A very thorough German scholar, Heinrich Heiser, authored an extensive study of the epidemiology of syphilis, published in 1882. He maintained that it was an old world disease in origin. More recently, researchers have uncovered skeletons in Italy with indications of syphilis dating back 600 BC and including many indications in Pompeii, the port city mentioned earlier. Did Americans visit one of the European ports, become infected by a mild form of syphilis, and carry it back to America? Or did Columbus' crew bring it to the Caribbean and spread it virulent form by means of their sexual exploitations of American women? It is possible that genetic research will one day tell us whether syphilis had its roots in Africa, Eurasia, or America. Until then, however, we must lean toward a Euro-African origin, but with the pre-contact American skeletal remains as a possible sign of ancient contact. In light of the evidence presented in this and earlier chapters, it is possible to suggest the following scenarios. 1. That the disease had an American origin, but that it was carried to Europe by early American visitors, in the meantime dying out or becoming very mild in America, until after the Spaniards introduced a new, more virulent strain, which might have hybridized with the surviving American variety. 2. That the disease had an Euro-African origin, but was introduced by the Norse after 900 AD, primarily in the eastern part of North America, which could help to explain the abandonment of numerous large urban areas after 1200 to 1450 AD, but became less virulent after population dispersal. 3. That American visitors to Britain brought the disease back to America at an early date. 4. That the American skeletons studied showed the effects of a different but perhaps related disease. It should be noted that the abandonment of urban areas, as noted, could have been due to the bubonic plague or other disease being introduced by the Norse. The plague as a result of ratus, European rats, and fleas arriving in the holds and supplies of Norse vessels. Since the plague reached Norway and probably Iceland, such a scenario is possible. Further research will be necessary to answer some of these questions, but one thing is certain: agency can no longer be denied to Americans. All right. And that is the end of this chapter, guys. All right. We were able to read the whole chapter, get it completed. Again, a lot of drop in this chapter. And, I enjoyed reading it. So much correlation to the research we've done already about America being the true old world, the true India, and all that. America's navigating the first seafarers, first navigators of the world. All right. It was all here in this one chapter. So I do hope you guys enjoyed reading this along with me. And we're basically almost done with this book. We got a couple more chapters we might finish off later on. But yeah, this was the end of this chapter, chapter 5, okay? Again, this was the book, The American Discovery of Europe, okay? By Jack D. Forbes. In reverse, not the other way around. We discovered Europe. We colonized Europe first. America's the true old world. Shout out to Jack D. Forbes. And shout out to all of you guys listening in all the way to the end of this chapter, today's video. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're able to correlate with all the past research what we read in this chapter today. You guys see, America's a true old world. All right. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate all my Patreons. Appreciate all my supporters, moderators, all the longtime followers. Thank you. Thank you for holding me up. Thank you for motivating me. Thank you for all the support all these years, okay? Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawaii.